Welcome to the Stranger Conversations podcast, where we explore the lives and lessons of those around us, hidden in plain sight. I'm your host, Tay Jones. Hello and welcome to episode 10 of the Stranger Conversations podcast. On today's show, I speak with tech entrepreneur Jeremy Horne. We dive into his fascinating life and his passion for storytelling, which has led to his next great endeavor, Winny.chat. As you'll hear, Winny is the future of storytelling. This amazing app allows you to change the way you pass down memories through generations, helping you build deeper connections with those you care about the most. This conversation was a great one for me as I, consider myself a storyteller at heart. I'm really looking forward to connecting further with Jeremy and utilizing Winny to document my life in a meaningful way that, one day I can pass down to my children. Before we jump into today's podcast, remember, if you'd like to be my next guest, head on over to strangerconversationspodcast.com or realtayjones.com/podcast. Find a date and time that work for you and we'll connect. If being on the show isn't something you're interested in, but you happen to know someone with an incredible life to share, make sure you share the show with them and encourage them to sign up. Each episode of the Stranger Conversations podcast belongs to my guest. You're welcome to talk about or promote anything you'd like on the show. All I ask is that you're willing to be interviewed about your life and that you're not afraid to share that life with my listeners. All past and future episodes of the show are available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, as well as my website. Don't forget to like, follow, share, and subscribe to the Stranger Conversations podcast so you don't miss out on the conversations to come. And be sure to follow me on social media at realtayjones on most platforms. Links to me and the podcast, as well as links to connect further with Jeremy and Winny, are located in this episode's show notes. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce you to my guest, Jeremy Horne. Let's try it again.
Hello, Tay.
Jeremy, how are you?
I'm very good. How are you?
Good. Hey, welcome to the podcast. I tried to call a second ago and it said unavailable. I thought maybe I was having some technical difficulties, but it looks like we figured it out.
Well, actually, it rang, and just as I was reaching for the pickup button, then it cut out again. So I was hoping you'd buzz back.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, well, again, welcome to the podcast. Appreciate you signing up. Really looking forward to chatting with you today.
Yeah, well, your sister told me about it, and I thought it would be great to have a chat. And then I had a look on your website, and I like what I read, so I'm definitely looking forward to having this chat.
Yeah, great. Well, my last guest also had an accent.
Is that right?
Yeah,
okay.
I know you're in the UK. Is that where you're from, or are you from Australia as well?
Mostly Australia, yeah. It's what we call a mongrel accent back in Australia. So it's a real mix, but most of it is Aussie.
Okay, great. Well, I'd love to learn a little bit about you. And you had mentioned in an email that you have an app coming out. Really excited to hear about that, Winny.chat. I'm sure you'll tell us all about it. Yeah, and it sounds like, it's really about sharing conversations and stories with one another, and I love that. So that's great.
Yeah, well, no, there's definitely a strong tone here with what you're doing. I mean, it seems that your podcast is all about basically getting people to share stories.
Yeah, and that's kind of where the podcast started. It was just, I love people. So I love talking to people. If I didn't record it, I would do it anyway. And I, just kind of come to realize over time, I listen to a ton of podcasts, but they're always, somebody famous, somebody that everybody already knows, and you don't typically learn anything new about them. But, even on the website there, just kind of like the not so average that walk among us. Those are the people those are the people I want to hear from, and, maybe share a little bit of everybody's story. Everybody has something to tell. So yeah, just, give a little bit of a platform for the rest of us to share their lives and what they've learned along the way. So
Yeah, well, no, we're well and truly aligned in terms of that. No, I'm very. This is really what it's all about. Is everybody does have a story to share, and as you said, it's just the big names, the people we know. I mean, they don't necessarily have the most interesting stories to share. I actually find some of the people I speak with, they've just got incredible stories. So, as you said, just having a platform to hear from kind of the everyday person is really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there we go. And today we're going to learn about Jeremy here. So, first of all, I'm just curious what takes you to the UK. And I feel like I talk to a lot of Australians, and a lot of them don't live in Australia. So I'm curious what took you to the UK, or have you lived there a long time, or?
Yeah. So look, I'll give you the long version, and by all means jump in. But so I was born in Zimbabwe. My parents are both English, and they were journalists. So they were traveling around and working in interesting parts of the world, and ended up in Zimbabwe, working for the local rag over there. And whilst they were there, popped my sister out, and then me. And then when I was around 3, so I don't actually remember any of it, but somewhere around 3, we hopped on a big cruise ship called the Windsor Castle and cruised over to England.
Okay.
Which is where I lived until I was about 8, and then we decided, well, I say we, my parents decided that they were going to have a crack at moving over to New Zealand, where my dad's parents had emigrated years and years before. So we went to New Zealand. This is in the early 80s, and it was, even as a kid, it felt like we'd gone back about 100 years in time. And I think for my parents, that was even more the case. So I think we had around 9 months there, and then they pressed the eject button and ended up in Perth in Western Australia. And back then, again, in the 80s, the west coast of Australia was... it was buzzing. It had all sorts of things going on. I don't know whether you remember the Australia 2 battle in the America's Cup, but it was the first time any other country had basically wrestled the America's Cup away from America for about 100 years. And it was a big, well-known personality in Perth who had sort of invested in it. And there's this famous quote for our Prime Minister at the time, who, when they won it, because it was this big sort of comeback with the Australia 2 ship Winny, and when they won it, I remember Bob Hawke, who was the Prime Minister, had this quote where he said, anyone who expects people to come in and work today is a bloody idiot. And basically that kind of summed up Australian politics at the time. And it was just a really interesting time, I think, to be in a place that was growing, still a long way back in time to a certain extent, but lots going on. And I use that Australia 2 story just because it kind of put Perth on the map for a period of time there, at least to Americans anyway, because they eventually then got to host the next America's Cup, and that was out of the port of Fremantle. And so for a little bit of time, I think Perth was perhaps well known by Americans back in the 80s. And then, so essentially having English parents, I, at some point in my life, decided that I wanted to work abroad, and England was a very easy option because I got a British passport.
Okay.
So I came over to the UK and worked here, and kind of had a philosophy of saying yes to a lot of things, and that included the opportunity to go and work over in Dubai, where it just so happens that my sister and her family were based at the time as well. And I'd been to Dubai for a holiday, and it was kind of interesting, and this is 2010. So it was kind of an interesting place, but it was, there was lots of construction, and leaving London, which is obviously a pretty well-established city, and then going to somewhere that was just sprouting up out of the sand, it was chalk and cheese. So initially when I went over there, I was like, yeah, it's a fun place for a holiday, but I'm not so sure. And no sooner had I got back, the company I was contracting to said, well, look, we need someone over there in Dubai. What do you say? And so I said, well, look, let's give it 3 months, and I'll head over there and see what we think. And this time going back there and spending a lot more time with my sister and her family, I was having a ball. So I decided to hang in there. And a couple of days before I'd left to go there, I'd been at a music festival and met my now wife at this music festival. So she eventually turned up in Dubai, and we eventually decided to get married. And so far, as they say, the rest is history. So this is why, a very long answer to your question. I find myself back in the UK at the moment because we came back to spend some time with our friends that we have over here. And of course, my wife's family is all over here in the UK. So we came back to spend a bunch of time with them. And we've been here since May, just hanging out and spending time with people.
Gotcha. So your wife is English then?
She is through and through, and she would love to live in the UK, but having just battled through an English winter, it's reminded me why I was quite keen to get back to Australia. And it was a fairly brutal winter. It was very cold, as far as England goes, anyway. Very different to some of the winters you guys get over there in the US. But yeah, it was tough, and we all kind of got taken out over Christmas with some mutant flu virus and it was tough going. But I think the thing that has been really interesting, and most of the people that I bring this up with are very kind of curious as to how we've done it. So the time that we've been traveling now for about 2.5 years. So we actually sold our house in Perth and moved over to Sydney and spent about 6 months there, but never really settled in. And when we sold the house, we bought a caravan. We thought, well, if we're going to move to Sydney, let's make some fun out of this and make a caravan adventure to get across. So we caravanned from Perth and went down the bottom of Australia and around to Sydney. And this was kind of during the COVID pandemic, on the back of it. So it was still happening. And we had avoided COVID pretty successfully because Perth had pretty much just put essentially it just kind of stopped everything going in and out of Perth. So it had no cases of COVID, which meant that life just kind of went on as normal. And getting across Australia again, we had been fine. It wasn't until we got to Sydney and it felt like we kind of opened the doors to the car and it just kind of blew up into our faces, which was unfortunate timing because we were due to be flying back for my wife's brother's wedding about a week after we got to Sydney. So we then found ourselves having to try and figure out how to still make the flights and recover from COVID and everything else. But yeah, long and short of that is we then spent about 6 months hanging out in Sydney, didn't really settle in, and decided that we would just go off and spend some more time in the caravan. So we started driving up and went all the way to the top and got up there and said, well, why don't we keep going? And basically just fumbled together this plan to travel around Australia, which ended up being about 10 months of our lives. And we've got at the time he was 5, so we were homeschooling him. And it was just incredible. We just had an amazing adventure. I finally got to see parts of Australia that tourists come over and they see, and you'll end up having a chat with them and you find that they've been to more places than you have. Whereas now finally I can actually say, well, actually, no, I've been to most of those places. And traveling, doing it in a caravan is a very different experience to hotels and Airbnbs. You really get to kind of drive to places you just wouldn't get to. So, for instance, you've got wildlife parks and you can just park your caravan there and it's overlooking these incredible views or overlooking beaches. Some places, there's literally not another soul around for hundreds of miles. And you'll find these just incredible sandy beaches that you'll have to yourselves. So it really was just an amazing experience. And that was 2023 was largely that experience of caravanning. And then work-wise, I had some meetings over in the US. Mm-hmm. So we then decided it was time to head to the US on our way through to the UK. So we had 3 months in America at the start of 2024. And again, we just kind of had the adventure bug by then, and we hired a car. And so originally flew into LA and then hired a car and drove, caught up with a bunch of friends, had a few meetings, and found our way over to Chattanooga, where we had some friends over there, and then drove our way back. So we had a nice 3-month road trip across the US. And it worked out well because I didn't realize we had a 3-month limit on how long we could stay there. And it turns out we were actually there just 1 day shy of that limit. So,
oh man, I didn't realize it was 3 months. I was thinking it was 6 months for some reason. But
yeah, it hadn't even occurred to me. I'm so used to just going places and either not being there that long that you need to worry, or being places like in Europe with the British passport, where for the most part, or at least pre-Brexit, you could kind of hang out there as long as you wanted. So it's not really something I was thinking about. But yeah, it wasn't until we were leaving, and it's like, wow, we actually got that pretty close.
That's
and then we ended up in the UK, and through the US and here in the UK, we've been doing house sits, which is through a website called Trusted House Sitters. And we just stayed in just some of the most incredible houses. And obviously, if you're doing an Airbnb, these days, I find with Airbnbs, it tends to be a house that's been specifically set up as an Airbnb, and it feels it's kind of lost some of the original magic that you'd get through staying in someone else's house, basically, and having everything there. But the beauty of doing trusted house sitters is you're doing it because you're looking after someone's pets. So you're literally there in their house, and some of the ones. My wife seems to have a knack for just applying to ones that are just incredible houses. And at the moment, we're in a Victorian boathouse where you would park your boats underneath the house. That's literally hangs out over the Thames, and it's just. It is quite magical. We just need a little more sun, but and we're looking after a couple of dogs, and this is how we've managed to spend the last 9 months in the UK without spending a cent on accommodation. Basically, it's been incredible.
Yeah, just being a dog sitter. It's kind of funny because one of my favorite, I love movies, but one of my favorite like feel good movies, especially around the holidays, is called The Holiday, where they swap houses. Yeah, that's what you reminded me of. With her great little cottage.
Yeah, no, it is actually a bit like that. Without actually, in our case, without having to swap the house, we just inherit pets, and we've had alpacas and pigs, and obviously lots of dogs and cats that we've looked after. But I think we've probably stayed in about 9 houses over the course of the 9 months that we've been here, and it's really interesting. It's a community. It's you get a chance to meet the family. I mean, obviously, people, if you're staying in their house and looking after their pets, they want to have a chat with you and get to know you as well as they can. And it seems that at least everyone we've met, they're just really good people. They're just, I think anyone who's willing to give up their house and have relative strangers move in and trust their pets with them, I think for the most part they're generally fairly open, interesting people, which has certainly been our experience. And so anyone who is thinking about traveling and perhaps thinks the cost of travel, even with a family, and our son's now recently turned 7, even with kids, or in our case a kid, it's very doable. And we've actually saved money whilst we've been traveling because we've had very few outgoings. So and we've had the experience of meeting people and staying places that you wouldn't necessarily stay if you were looking at hotels and Airbnbs, like finding our way into little villages. And, as I said, this one that we're in at the moment that kind of hangs into the Thames is just very different to what we'd otherwise have traveling.
Yeah. And what'd you say it was? A Trusted House Sitter? That's the website?
Yeah. Trusted House Sitters. Yeah. Trusted House Sitters.
Yeah, I got to look that up. That sounds like a great way to do it on the cheap. I guess if you want to watch some dogs or whatever it is. But
and in that case, that's been a bonus because our son, he loves animals, and it's actually fun. It's fun having some animals, whether it's cats or dogs or pigs and chickens and things like that. But it really just makes the whole thing a lot more interesting. You tend to go for walks and you get to meet the locals. You feel it feels more like traveling as opposed to holidaying. So and obviously there's restrictions in that you do need to get back and look after the whatever pet it is you're looking after. So in that sense you're a little restricted. But when we've needed more flexibility, that's when we rented Airbnb, and I've got no issues doing that, given that we've really had such a good run with all these different houses we've stayed in.
Yeah. I want to ask you about the caravan piece because now you're talking my language. I lived in an RV. That's what we call them here, right? So I lived in one for a year and a half. Absolutely loved it. But I know American RVs are much different than like caravans in the UK as far as size, etc. In Australia,
your RVs. Yeah, it's all one. it's all one vehicle, right? Like, so when you say RV, it's typically you're driving the same vehicle. It's not
It
like you're
can
hitching
be.
a caravan on the back, right?
It can be, but mine was what you would typically call like a caravan, where it was like a travel trailer, is what we call it. So it's
Gotcha.
you pulled
Okay.
it along. But in Australia, are they also very small, like you'd find in the UK, or are they much
No,
bigger?
so
Okay.
they're very different. So our one was 21 foot of kind of livable space, and then there's probably about another 6 foot by the time you take in the different parts that you tie in and bits hanging off the back and things like that. So it was long, and I'd never towed a caravan before. I've towed some trailers around here and there, but yeah, it was quite intimidating, to be honest. Suddenly being on the roads, and once you're onto the country roads in Australia, you've just got these massive road trains
Hmm.
that are coming along, and I mean they rule the road. Like there's no
That's
point
like
trying to
the
compete.
semi trucks with like six trailers
Yeah,
on the back, right?
exactly,
Yeah. Okay.
exactly. That's right. Yeah, yeah. And they'll have all sorts of heavy things on the back, from cows to bits of whatever satellites and things like that that they're taking into the middle of Australia. So, and actually, when we first got our car, so I know Isuzu, is that much of a brand these days over in the US?
No, not at all. I think they
Okay.
still make some things, but Isuzu, the car manufacturer, you're not going to see one unless it's from like the 80s or something.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay, okay. So, well, Isuzu's pretty, yeah, it's pretty big in Australia, and it's tends to have a good reputation for, if you're going to be pulling a caravan, it can pull a pretty good tow load. But I mean, again, I've never owned a 4x4, so the whole experience was new. And the one that we had, they had just kind of released this new model where it had the driver assist, but the problem was that you would be going along the road, and then you'd have to sort of pull into the side lane and keep moving whilst a massive semi-trailer is coming. But of
Hmm.
course, the car's then trying to adjust to get you back into the middle of the road. So for the first couple of weeks, I'm wrestling with the car that's trying to get us back into the middle of the road, and I'm trying to obviously steer away from these big vans that are coming. And it turns out it was actually a software issue, so they actually had to issue an update that I had to take it into Isuzu. But that, coupled with the fact that I hadn't driven with a caravan before, and driven with a big car and everything else, it was a pretty pretty challenging start to what, like I said, ended up being 10 months on the road. I was a lot more confident driving it towards the end. But the first couple of weeks, they were tough going. But again, look, I'd say to anyone listening that, like anything new that you're doing is obviously hard and a little bit scary. And obviously, you try to. I'd done a caravan driving course before we'd left, so
Okay.
I tried to stack the odds of safety in our favour. But any of these things, you just really, for the most part, you got to get out there and give it a go, and just accept that when you first do it, it's going to be hard, but eventually it'll get easier.
That's right, especially backing it up. That's the hard part. But
Oh
yeah, once
yeah,
you get
that's
used to
right.
it, you're
Yeah.
good. So when you
Well, and this
oh, go
this
ahead.
is when you get your wife to help out with that, but
That's right.
that can be a disaster.
Yeah, yeah, you
Depending
end up
on
with a
how you're
whole
doing.
nother set of problems with
Yeah,
that.
exactly.
you
That's
learn
right.
you learn how well you can communicate with one another, I think.
Communication becomes
Yeah,
key.
yeah.
Absolutely.
So when you were in the U.S., though, I mean, L.A. to Southeast Tennessee and back, that's a heck of a road trip. I mean, you're almost all the way across the country. What'd you think of the U.S. when you were over here?
Yeah, so I was, well, actually, my wife and I were living in New York for what was almost a couple of years, and,
Okay.
and then we got pregnant, and I mean that's a whole other story. But yeah, basically, we got pregnant whilst we were there. We wanted to have a home birth, and we were in Brooklyn at the time, and it was actually very difficult. Even though I had decent insurance with the company I was working with, the insurers were not going to insure or cover a home birth. They said it's way too risky.
Hmm.
So, and that coupled with I was at that point starting to kind of ramp up my own thing in parallel with the work that I was doing, and we said, well, let's just go back to the UK and we'll pop this little guy out somewhere near to Helen's mum. And Helen, my wife, rang around, found an Airbnb, and had a chat with her, and we made plans to stay there for 3 months, and it was fairly close to my wife's mum.
Yeah.
And she said, oh, by the way, do you mind if we have a pop out a baby while we're there? She said, absolutely, I'd love you to do that. We were going to do the same, and it didn't work out. So somebody needs to have a baby in this place. So come on over and do that. And again, we ended up becoming friends with those guys as well. It was, again, just an amazing experience. And they were living in a separate property on the land, but a little guy popped out, and we obviously took him over, and they had a couple of young kids, and we've stayed friends over the years.
Yeah, man. Yeah, you've been everywhere. I think that I may have answered my own question with what, talking about.
And I kind of forgot the question. Remind me, where were we on that one?
I was just curious, what you thought about the U.S. going through the,
Yeah, sorry. So yeah, I did. I went off on the tangent there. So no, the U.S. We loved it. I mean, the beauty of the U.S. is you guys have got this huge chunk of land that is incredibly diverse. You've got all these different climates. It really is like having the equivalent of Europe, except the convenience that everyone actually speaks the same language, and you've got a single currency, which just makes it easier for getting around, and obviously you don't have border issues and things like that. So we had an absolute ball. I mean, New York is a city that I think it's a great city to live in, probably when you're young and if you're happy to live with 10 of your friends in the same sort of place, so that you're not spending crazy amounts of money on rent. Mm-hmm. I think it's a really good city to live for a while, and if you want to get the most out of it, then I think you really need to be a millionaire, to be honest, was my impression, because it was not a city where we could stay, but on the other hand, we knew we were only going to be there for a short period of time, so we were kind of happy just to invest in the experience. But I remember that just being my prevailing thought, was incredible city. If I was 20 years younger and out partying all the time and living with friends and things like that, I imagine it'd be an amazing place to hang out for a while. Mm-hmm. But for us, we had done almost a couple of years there, and we'd traveled around as much as we could, and we had a great time. And as he said, that road trip that we did took us all over the place, and just everywhere we went was amazing. American people are super friendly. I actually think some of the most hospitable people in the world. You guys just seem incredibly proud of your country, and I think for the most part, at least the people we met, and we met quite a few, you're all just happy to have a yarn, happy to have a, like what we're doing now, just sit here and have a chat and get to know people, and I think to a certain extent just kind of show off the country and show off what is really an amazing country.
Yeah. Well, I would agree with all of that. So I'm glad none of my countrymen embarrassed us.
Not at all. No. Honestly, just some of the most hospitable people I've ever encountered. And and Australians are very friendly, but I find that Americans really are just so quick to kind of literally open the door and say, hey, come and hang out. I mean, we were at a winery sipping wines and chatting with a couple, and they're like, yeah, come and hang out with us for a few days, which it's almost too friendly, but it was it's just kind of indicative of the experience we had. So I love the place.
Yeah, that's great. And it sounded like you were doing some work in New York and Dubai. I mean, is this all related? What sort of work are you in?
Yes, it's been. I kind of popped out from university just as the internet was becoming a thing. So my career's just always been in some form of digital media and technology. And when people ask me and they're like, "What do you do?" and I'm like, it's kind of like internet stuff, but not so much on the IT side. Very much more on the creative and helping companies try to figure out how to use the internet in different ways. So it could be helping to figure out some software that needs to be built. It could be coming up with plans around marketing. But it's just kind of allowed me the flexibility to kind of, for the most part, work anywhere in the world. And certainly when COVID happened and suddenly remote work became the thing, that did open the doors to just more work with US-based clients. So it's given it. I don't think we would have this opportunity to have done as much travel as we've done in the last 2-3 years, and if it wasn't for that kind of shift in the way that people can work. And certainly, I mean, I was working for a company at the time, consulting, and I was in Australia, and I used to get up at 4 a.m. and get online at 4:30 so I could try to align my kind of work hours with theirs, but there was still a big shift because they were mostly in LA. Yeah. But I was the only person working for them who was not in the US, And then COVID came, and suddenly it just made everything easier because everyone was suddenly remote, and suddenly people were balancing hours all over the place, and people were happy to align a little more closely with my hours and things like that. And as I say, since then, it's kind of been the norm. I mean, I know there's this big push in trying to get people back into the office now, but there's still plenty of remote working options, and it's been brilliant for us. It really has.
Yeah. So I was kind of doing the opposite for a while. So I was the only person in the US doing work with, like consulting work with a company in the UK. And,
Oh wow!
and they also had some people in Australia, and the hours was really weird. So I'm in Arizona. Arizona does not do daylight savings time. So I thought, oh, this is going to be great when I moved here. And then I realized that you actually have to keep track of it even more because everybody moves around you. And
Yeah,
and then
exactly.
and then in the UK, I didn't even know that daylight savings was actually a thing outside of the US. I thought it was only here for some reason. But it's like a 3-week difference. So when we switched, the UK wouldn't switch for like 3 more weeks. And then I'd be talking to people in Australia, and it boggled my mind because I'm looking at the time difference, and they were like 17 hours in the future. I'm like, how?
Yeah,
Like,
exactly,
it's like that is
exactly.
insane.
Yeah,
Like
that's
it's
right.
literally tomorrow, and
Yeah.
it makes no sense, and you're trying to figure
That
it
was
out.
kind of my whenever I'd walk up to a conference call, I'd pretty much every call, which I'm sure grew old pretty quickly for the other guys, but I thought it was hilarious just hopping on and saying everything's good in the future. We haven't blown anything up yet. So.
Yep. Yeah.
And as you say, I mean, it's so far into the future, but that daylight savings bit, it can mess you up. I mean, I've had a couple of times where things have gone into the calendar, and unless you set it up properly with the right sort of primary time zone, you suddenly find that you're an hour late or an hour early to a meeting because your calendar's adjusted, but their one hasn't shifted. So
Yeah.
it really can get very confusing.
Yeah. And here in Arizona, since we don't switch the all the different time zones in the U.S. because it's so vast across. So part of the year we're on Pacific time, and part of the year we're in Mountain time. So we actually have a kid that lives in California and is working and everything, and so half the year he's an hour before us, and half the year he's on the same time. So yeah, it makes it tough.
Yeah, I think I mean. Eventually, I'm pretty sure daylight savings will get scrapped. I mean,
They've been
it's
talking
I don't
about
know
it.
whether yeah, well, I don't know whether you've read, but apparently it's like this. Essentially, it's a massive data experiment that just provides. There's a guy, and I forget his name, but Matt Walker, I think it is, and he wrote a book about sleep. And he actually talks about how daylight savings the day after or whatever the day of, just that 1 hour shift for everyone who's experiencing it. The number of heart attacks and all sorts of other incidents, whether it's road accidents from people just being a bit groggy and things like that, but essentially the number of accidents and deaths and heart attacks that occur around the shift of daylight savings is an anomaly. It's
Really?
a huge number compared with every other day of the year. So,
Huh.
so yeah, and I must admit, like having a young kid when you're navigating that 1 hour, it does actually make things just a little more difficult.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't heard anything about like the different health, consequences of it. I'd have to maybe check out that book. That sounds interesting for sure.
Yeah, it's called Why We Sleep, and I'm pretty sure his name's Matt Walker. So definitely worth a read. Or I'm big into audiobooks. So I tend to listen to way too many books these days. But
Okay.
yeah, but it's either listen to it or have a read. But definitely a good one to pick up.
Awesome. Appreciate that. So all your work then, is it mostly just freelance consulting, or do you work for a company, or is it just you're just off on your own with your own
Yeah,
company?
so these days, since we left the US, it's all freelance consulting. When I
Okay.
was in the US, I was working with a British company who had set up an office over in the US,
Okay.
and that was the opportunity that had come up. They said, "Well, look, do you want to?" I was flying back and forth, and they said, "Do you want to just go over there?" And most of the work we were doing with it was with Ford, so I was actually flying a lot into Dearborn.
Okay.
And I said, well, look, Detroit's kind of cool, but it's not where I want to live. So how about I live in New York, and then we can, and we're part of a big agency network, WPP. So we kind of had a whole bunch of other companies within the network that could kind of host us and just make that whole transition a bit easier.
Okay.
So New York was a pretty good option as far as the network went, and And for me and my wife, the idea of just living in New York, was a big deal. Just felt like a really great opportunity. Like if you get a chance to go to the US, New York is certainly, for people outside of America anyways, is certainly one of those cities that you get pretty excited about.
Yeah. Yeah, that's funny. I've actually never been to New York City. I've been to New York
Oh, wow.
State, but
Yeah, wow.
I've never gone to New York City. But it's on the list. One of these days, I'll make it there.
Yeah, well, you've got a lot of cities to choose from over there. So,
Yeah.
so you've got a few to get through.
Yeah, and here, I mean, Phoenix. A lot of people don't realize it, but it's the fifth largest city in the U.S. I mean, it's a massive city. There's not that many people in the state as a whole compared to some other states, but the city of Phoenix is huge. So.
Yeah, I had no idea that Phoenix was that big a city. So there you go.
Yeah, and so do you? When you do your freelance consulting, are you working mostly with smaller companies or larger companies, or a little bit of mix of both?
Yeah, it's mainly, I'd say, small to medium. I mean, generally companies that have somewhere between 50 and 150 people.
Okay.
And I tend to work with just one or two at a time. So I kind of take on a role within the company that they're not quite big enough to hire a full team internally. So I can come on as like a fractional CMO. Or it could just be a short-term strategy project to go in there and figure out what they need. But more often than not, on the back of doing a strategy, it does then identify a bunch of things they need to do. I mean, this is kind of what providing consultancy work is about. Is you're going to identify gaps that need to be filled, and then at that point, there's options as to how you fill that. And in some of those cases, then I would step in for a period of time and take on that role. And I've got essentially a team around me. So nobody full time, but I've got a whole bunch of contractors, and some of them are on retainers if there's enough work in whatever that area might be.
Yeah.
So I can kind of provide a whole bunch of services for these companies without them having to hire internally. And then eventually the idea is that they get either big enough to start to hire those roles internally, or just change the structure of the company and no longer have a need for that role that I might be filling.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. And is that something, I mean, I'm assuming you love doing that. I always kind of like doing it, working on my own and just kind of having your own schedule and doing all that, especially since you travel so much, it's got to be a great benefit for you.
Exactly. And generally, look, these days, it's generally companies that I know because I've been referred through someone else that I know really well. So it's a really good example of why it's so important just to work on your network. And and I think it's so important as well. Like wherever you work, like just you really that classic quote of kind of leave them wanting more, which I can't remember who it was, but it was an actor, and the actor basically said, "Listen, like when you're performing, you want to walk out at the point where they still want more." And
Right.
It's kind of been my philosophy work-wise is get to the point, especially when I was in the UK and I was contracting, was to just get to the point where everything's being done really well. Everyone's happy. You built some really good relationships, and I've had a great time. And then more often than not, that was a great opportunity for me to go off and figure out what the next thing was going to be. And sometimes the next thing was just to take a few months off. And, this was when I was single and would go off and spend a month in Thailand, or go off and do some traveling with some friends around the US, or go back home to Australia and hang out there for a while. And then come back and figure out the next thing. So yeah, it's been a really good way of working for me. The idea of turning up to work every day and doing a job that I'm not that excited about, I just couldn't do it. I think most people can't do it. I think there's a lot of people who just kind of have to almost desensitize themselves to be able to get through it. So, but yeah, it's just something that's kind of organically structured itself, I guess, based on how I want to structure my life, and it's worked out well. And then, of course, we talked a bit about it at the start. I've got this startup, which is a company called Storyteller, and the reason it's called Storyteller is I wanted to essentially be a what is essentially a data platform that is the Wikipedia of human stories. And the idea being that, as we said at the start, everyone's got a story to tell. And I've had this kind of nerdy obsession since I was a kid. My dad came home with a big VHS video camera when I was about 12, and he had borrowed it from the office. And I'd always been fascinated by film and video. So now suddenly I had this video camera that I could use for all sorts of different things. Yeah. And it just happened that at the time my grandparents from England were over visiting. So I filmed all sorts of things, and most of it pretty badly, and I'd play around with some pretty dodgy stop motion. It was really hard back in the VHS days. But my grandparents were there, and I did actually ask them some questions about what my mum was like when she was a kid, and what was it like in the olden days and things like that. So we ended up with these little snippets of footage that were actually really valuable to us as a family, especially once they'd passed away. We now had my grandparents telling some stories, and I'd done a lot more of that when I was living in the UK, interviewing my nana, and just I've got hours of her talking about the good old days. She was actually amazing, actually. I found this with quite a few people of their era, even though they didn't grow up around video cameras and things like that, but they're incredibly relaxed and very natural. Like you point the camera and they just sit there and chat. And whereas some people, even though they've grown up around cameras, can be just a lot more awkward around knowing that it's there.
Yeah.
But yeah, anyway, my nana, her name was Winny, or Winifred, and the app that we're building, so essentially we've got Storypedia, that's the company. We're building a platform which, as I say, is about connecting people through shared stories. It becomes this kind of platform of basically short life stories. And the very first experience that we're building on the platform is an app called Winny, and Winny is focused, so it's named after my nana because she was such a good storyteller, and it's focused on connecting family and close friends much more deeply. So there's many different things that we can do around how you connect people through stories. You can build stronger communities. You can use it within companies, especially these days where you've got a lot of remote companies, to try and build culture and bring teams closer together. So these are kind of some of the things that we will eventually explore. But where I wanted to start was really what I've been doing for a lot of my life as a hobby, which is just interviewing people and hearing their life stories. And obviously I've done it mostly with my family and close friends, but then I've got just total strangers that I've done it for as well. And
it's video. You're doing
as video.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, as video. And so I originally set up a website because I got to the point where I had all this footage and I'm like, well, it doesn't really belong on YouTube. And yes, I was sticking it up on Vimeo, but it still felt like it needed a dedicated place. So I set up a website called Stories for Life, and which is still live. So it's got a bunch of people sharing stories, and I opened it up to in a way that anybody could come in there, answer some questions, and start recording their stories. But what was really interesting was I found people love the idea of sharing stories, and for the most part, everybody wants to capture their parents' stories. A lot of people want to capture their stories and have them passed on and their legacy and things like that. But it was something that very few people would do themselves. So they would do it if it was me interviewing them. And even then, people would be like, nobody wants to hear my story. And I'm like, well, let's just sit down and have a chat and see how it goes. And more often than not, I just couldn't shut people up. I just keep going. A little bit like you with me, where I'm just waffling on here. But I think most people do want to share their stories. And I think most people are kind of flattered when they get the opportunity to have a genuine conversation where someone takes an interest in their lives. And where that really matters, especially in this day and age, where I think, in fact, we know that data tells us that we're more connected than ever, that people feel more disconnected than ever. And there's essentially a loneliness pandemic or an epidemic that's forming, and COVID definitely didn't help with that, but it's still very much the case. So my hope is really with Winny is it's an app that is going to enable families to build more meaningful, stronger connections within their families, and then also within people's friends groups as well. And it does that by enabling you to have a conversation like what we're having right now, but you can do it as audio and as video. and it will prompt things. So let's say it knows a bit about Tay and it knows a bit about me, and that's based on whatever it is that I've been comfortable sharing. So then it'll say, well, hey, Tay, why don't you ask Jeremy about this? And likewise, it'll say, Jeremy, why don't you ask Tay about this? And so we'll sort of have some prompts that we can ignore if we want, but it'll help us have a conversation that hopefully connects us through things that are meaningful for each other. And if you look at just the kind of classic one, which is, and I tell this to everyone, which is just make some time to interview your parents because, and again, one of my kind of marketing slogans there is that your parents won't be around forever, but their stories can. And don't wait for the perfect time to do it. Like everyone's got a recording device in their hands. So just pull out your phone, and which very few of us use it for actually making phone calls, but pull out your phone and start recording some video. And again, when he's there, just to make that process much, much easier. But more importantly, to also then make sure that if you do then go to the trouble of recording the stories that come out of those conversations, that they don't just lie stagnant somewhere, whether it's lost in the noise of YouTube or sitting there on a hard drive or a thumb drive, where we've got all these really interesting ways that we will then kind of play them back and bring them to life, and all these different use cases of how you can bring those stories to life, including if you wanted to have a book that could come out, it can then generate books on the back of the stories that you've told. So it could be in my dad's case, how did you meet my mum? And my dad tells that story. So great, we've captured that story, and you can watch that within the Winny app. But then you can also generate a book. And by the way, I should say for anyone that might be listening, some of these bits are further down the track. So what we're launching initially is all about capturing those stories, and then eventually we'll add on the ability to create books. And then the other one it's actually, I was going to say it's really interesting, and it is really interesting, but it's kind of 50-50 in terms of the people who love it and hate it, which is the idea that once you've recorded all of these stories, you could then have this version of you. So we can have digital Tay, your avatar essentially. And again, when I talk to investors and they say, well, how are you using AI? Obviously AI at the moment in terms of investment tends to kind of help that conversation. And I say, well, look, AI, and certainly for someone who is submerged in technology, AI is incredible. It really is. But I actually think one of the few things it can't replace is human connection. So actually what I'm really interested in is how we use that technology to help us connect as humans in a better way. And again, that's what we're hoping with Winny. And then the idea is, as you've recorded those stories and now we know a whole bunch about you or me or whoever it is that's recorded those stories, at some point you can flick a switch and say, all right, well, let's turn on my digital avatar. And the idea is that it becomes a very authentic version of you because you've told all of these authentic stories. And it's not just making things up. The technology to have a digital Tay or a digital Jeremy is essentially, it's already a commodity. There's a bunch of companies who have created some amazing tech where you can record yourself for about 2 minutes and then it can go off and it will look like you or talk like you, or it'll kind of borrow some of those mannerisms that you have. So the technology to do that is already there, but it's, in my eyes, it's really a novelty because unless that digital version of me is able to talk about my real life experiences, then it's just not me. And that's where I think we're doing something really interesting with Winny, is because we're going to have all of this content. If people do decide they want to have that digital version of themselves, then you've got the ability to have, let's say, your great-great-great-grandchildren can sit there and have a chat with you in a conversational manner as opposed to just watching your videos. But the conversation is all based on whatever stories that you shared. So it's serving those stories up in a conversational way, but it's all data that essentially was captured from real life stories that you shared. And that I think is really interesting. And when I tell that to, and again, investors get kind of lit up by that. But when I talk about that with people, some people are like, wow, that's amazing. Yeah, I definitely want that. And other people are like, ooh, I don't really like the idea of a digital version of me living on long after I'm around. So as I say, it tends to kind of be a 50-50. It's one of these kind of love or hate sort of things. But I talk about that because it's just one of many use cases that we can bring to life once we've captured the stories. The most important thing is just getting people to engage in a more meaningful conversation, to really take an interest in each other's lives, very much like what you're doing here with your podcast, which I think is brilliant. And through those conversations, you build rapport, and that can only be a good thing. It's we talked before about this loneliness pandemic, and it's essentially chipping away at those sorts of issues. It's giving people a platform to have a really deep, meaningful, interesting conversation, and that's the bit that is most of interest to me, capturing the stories and then however we then generate digital me's or books and things like that. That's kind of the side effect. And it's a really interesting, fun side effect. But the bit that matters is connecting with the people in your life now. And that's really what it's all about.
Yeah. Well, that is an interesting spin on it for sure. Kind of taking all the the knowledge and everything that's recorded and turning it into a digital you. I'm still thinking about it. Typically, that's a lot of this AI stuff. It just seems like tech for tech's sake. And a lot of it, I'm like, I just don't see a purpose for that. But I can see how this would be very interesting. If you had, your grandma and you want to listen to all the stories and everything and kind of come from the horse's mouth, so to.
Well, that's it. And conversational, right? Like,
Yeah.
and it won't just be your granny. It'll be you, right? Like, you can sit there and say, all right, I want to conjure up 90-year-old Tay, like Tay from the future. Like, what advice have you got for me in your wise, sage kind of way? Or you can go back to Tay in his 20s and say, hey, Tay, like, what was I thinking when this was happening? And so I think even just from the journaling experience would be interesting. But it's one of these things that I think until it's like any new tech, it's going to feel a bit weird. And people are going to have a fairly emotional, whether it's a good or bad reaction to whatever it is. And if you think about talking to my mum, passed away basically at the end of our caravanning trip, actually. So we just happened to be back in Sydney or close to Sydney when she went into hospital. And I've got so much video of my mum where I've asked her all sorts of questions, and it's probably dating back from 15, maybe 20 years ago, through to the early stages of when she had Alzheimer's, and it's just so comforting to know that I've got this video. I mean, one of the things that when you no longer have a parent in your life, you just one, yes, you miss your voice, but you also just miss certain things that they would say. And it's so nice being able to go back to those things. But what I was getting to there is that, am I ready to sit there and have a conversation with my mum as a digital avatar where it's her, but it's not her? I don't know. I don't know, to be honest. Like, it's one of those things that I think, but what's going to happen is that we've got no choice. Like, we've got it, like, right. Because you could point this tech at my Facebook page. And anything that I might have that's public, you can just grab some photos. You can grab a bit of video. You'll find some video of me somewhere and some photos of me. You'll hear my voice. So you can create digital me right now with the tech that's there, and then you can load up whatever content you want and have me say whatever you want. And that's now. That's based on today's tech. And as a lot of people say, this is as bad as it's ever going to be. So there will be like hundreds of digital Tays out there in the world, like it or not, that you have largely no control over. So again, part of what I'm saying is, well, let's be intentional about the stories that you're capturing. Let's be intentional about, because that questions are things like, what are the values of your family name? What do you stand for as a human being? Like, what have been some of the biggest challenges in your life? So really digging into what makes you tick, and by having those answers, the version of you is going to be a more authentic version of you. So, and that's my hope. I want it to get to the point where we can essentially say, look, if you want, you can essentially digitally sign this as the digital Tay that you are happy to represent you long after you're no longer around. That's kind of one of the things that we'll hopefully land on eventually.
Yeah. And that's kind of one of the things I was thinking about, because it's like you said, I mean, anybody who goes on the internet, right? You're going to find all kinds of videos that are made up, and, they may not be flattering, but this is kind of like the you on your own terms that you get to.
Exactly. Exactly.
I'm definitely seeing some value in that. And, and a few other things too. I mean, my mom passed away in November 2013, and there was, I don't remember one of my sisters ended up getting my mom some sort of like it was like story. It's sort of like this, but it was all story based. So written word, fill out this information. It kind of turns it into more of a book of it. But that
Yeah, I
wasn't.
think it's story. Was it Story Worth?
I think so. It could have been, but she never filled it out. So we actually didn't get
Well,
that.
that's the problem.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So we have the stories that we've heard, but we don't have anything like recordings necessarily of that, and we don't have anything like really documented historically. And she had an amazing life. She did some crazy things. Just half the stories you wouldn't even believe, because you're like, God, is insane. Like, she just lived like a wild life.
Yeah.
And then, pictures, and, that's one thing. I mean, I have like 20 something thousand photos on my phone right now, and I couldn't tell you what half of them were. They're just very, if I didn't put the little heart on my iPhone to save it as a favorite photo, like, I'm probably never going to see it. Every once in a while, I'll come across looking for something else, and I'll be like, oh, and I'll text it to a friend and say, hey, I just found this on my phone. You remember this, etc. But that'd be great to have a place. I'm assuming, and correct me if I'm wrong, but if, say, Winny, you get all these videos and it's a platform, right? So you can like log in and you can go and watch these things.
That's exactly what it is. Yeah. And it's, to a certain extent, I'm not trying to build a social network, but
Right.
it's what I call a family first social network. So the idea is that, once you're in the kind of bubble of Winny, if you're recording your stories, then anyone within your family who's also on it then would see those stories. So you can say, well, look, this is my family, so I'm happy for them to see these stories. Or you might record one that's just for yourself, and you just mark that off and say, this is private only to me. And you might even just have one with your partner or the kids and things like that. So yeah, you'll have those options, but I'm really trying to build a place where you've kind of got this bubble, which is your family, and you're capturing all of that, and it lives on in a way that you can feel confident that your kids and their kids and so on will have access to all of these amazing family stories. Because as you said, your mum obviously lived a life. And what we should do, Taz, is I've got a beta version right now. So I'll give you the details. Get on it, because what you can start to do is you can recall those stories on behalf of your mum. So you can tell the story of your mum and capture all of that. So at least then you know that all of these amazing things that your mum did, and you can hold up photos and tell the story of a photo that you might have there that's in a photo frame and things like that. So that's that's the next best thing. If someone's no longer around to tell it themselves, at least family can still recall those stories for them.
Yeah. Well, that's fantastic.
I'm
really liking this. How long have you been working on it?
Well, I mean, to a certain extent, I've kind of been working on trying to bring my experience. So my experience was, and again, like very similar to what we're doing here. My experience was that when I would sit there and record someone's stories, and I did it for some friends who were losing their parents because they had terminal diseases, and they knew that their time was coming. So I've sat there and recorded stories with them, and in most cases, I knew their parents, but perhaps not that well. And then after, I would say, wow, that's amazing how your mum did whatever. And they're like, really? Like, I didn't know that. And I'm like, how can you not know that? Like, how's that never come up? And what I'd also find was that you can't have a conversation where you take a genuine interest in someone's life where you don't feel a strong sense of connection with that person. And, as we talked about before, human connection really is one of the few things that just can't be replaced. AI is amazing. It can seem very human, but we will know the difference between a human connection, and we want to have those connections with people who matter to us, right? Like, we want to have those connections with our parents and with our kids and with our close family and with our close friends. So again, AI can't replace those people in your life. And that just requires you to make some intentional effort to actually sit there and have those conversations. So what I've been trying to do since, I don't know, probably 6-7 years ago when I first set up Stories for Life, was trying to make it so that everybody could have that experience of what it's like to connect through a meaningful conversation. And Stories for Life ended up being a really good kind of use case of why it doesn't work, and it doesn't work because of the friction of, right, we're gonna do some interviews on this day, and then they're like, oh wow, like, how am I looking, and what's it going to be about? There's so much gravitas in that process. So what I discovered was that stories are told in the moment, and really that was the big thing with Winnie. So we've been working on Winnie for about a year, which is in this day and age, it's actually too long to work on an app, especially for someone who lives in the tech world, just because things change so quickly.
Yeah,
I mean, when we started it, AI was becoming a thing, but we decided that we would build it without AI, and now we're already at a point where there's dozens of things that I'm like, geez, I wish we'd incorporated some AI this, and retrospectively we're incorporating some AI in terms of the way that it brings up prompts, and obviously what I talked about with digital Tay and things like that as well. But yeah, roughly about a year, and the big difference here is that Winnie just removes so much of that friction, and it does allow you to record stories in the moment. Like if we're having a conversation like this right now, but we're doing it through Winnie, then we're like, hey, let's record a story. So we press a button and that story comes through, whether it be audio or video and things like that. Or it can be a case of, I want my dad to tell the story of how he met my mum. So I can press a button and he'll get a little ping and say, come on, Dad, like, when are you going to tell the story? And maybe my sisters also asked for the same story. So after a while, it's what I kind of call this pressure that starts to bubble up around certain stories. And eventually, hopefully my dad will then answer those. And as it happens, my dad is at an age where he loves the idea of telling his story. So this beta version where we've been trying to obviously squash bugs and everything else, my dad's been a prolific user of it, which is great because I've got a whole bunch more stories of my dad now.
Yeah. And I just wanted to touch on something that you mentioned. I think we mentioned it at the very beginning too, but just like how today we are the most connected we've ever been, but we are by far the most disconnected from each other. So we have all of this stuff at our fingertips. We just, we would choose to send a text instead of make a phone call. We've made it so easy, but, something like this makes it very easy to kind of, turn the tables and actually, make more connections.
I hope so. I mean, that is my hope, is that I want to get this into the hands of as many people as possible. And like what I know from launching tech products is the thing that you launch with, no matter how good you think it is, no matter how much you think you've thought everything through, you've probably only got it somewhere between 5 and, if you're lucky, 40% right.
Oh, yeah.
So you've kind of just got to get it out there and find out what works, and then cut out the fat that doesn't work and add in the build up the bits that do work. So I'm really excited. I mean, we're probably about 4 or 5 weeks away from launching onto the App Store, and it'll be a kind of quiet launch because I've had a lot of conversations with people. It's on test flight at the moment, which is where we can do the beta testing. But just getting it onto the App Store will just make it a lot easier for people to be able to get access. And then once I'm confident, maybe 4 weeks after that we've resolved any other sort of lingering bugs and things like that, then we'll actually start doing some marketing and some paid activities and some collaborations with various, let's call them influencers, content creators. So hopefully that'll help us get a bit more traction.
Yeah.
But yeah, I really just can't wait to see how it does what I hope it will do, which is exactly what you said, just help people have better conversations. Because I think we're losing the art. I honestly think that, but like any muscle, if you're not working on it, I think people are just losing the art to have conversations.
Yeah. Like you said, you just have to start too. So, it might not be perfect and ready, but you're going to throw it out there, which is a big piece. I mean, that's why there's going to be a 2.0, right? And it's just going to be better.
Exactly.
But I do believe that a lot of people have lost, some of the ability to tell stories. I mean, that's one thing that I've always been a big believer of, is tell stories. And I love telling stories. It's actually on my resume. It's storyteller, because I think it is a great skill to have. Yeah, I think it is a lost art. But also, just some of the things, everything I've done in my life. I mean, when I leave, if I do something different, I mean, half the stuff I don't even remember, but what nobody can take away from you are the stories that you gained along the way. And then you get to
exactly.
So, I mean, and I'm kind of in like second career, right? So I'm already retired from a career where I worked really closely with a lot of guys, they become your brothers and sisters too, women as well. And one of the things I thought when I left that I thought, oh, well, oh, it's kind of a weird thing. Like I've been doing this for a long time and now I'm leaving. It's a little bit scary, but I got to do it. You got to take that first step. And I thought, oh, well, what happens? And what I came to realize is that everybody that I wanted to talk to, I still talk to because it's intentional, but also
Yeah.
I can never lose those stories. And I have those stories and I get to tell them all the time. And it kind of takes me back to that place where, something that, once meant something to me or once, a thing that I was once a part of, I now can live through those stories that way without being connected, personally,
But
physically.
connect.
Yeah.
Connect is the key word, right? Like
Yeah.
you literally connect through those stories. Like when you call up an old buddy and say, "Hey, remember the time we did whatever?"
Absolutely.
And yeah, I mean that is, and that's what it's all about. I mean, that's literally what it's all about. Like when I recorded my nana and she's telling these stories, I'm like, wow, really? Like that happened, and it's yeah, stories, they're kind of magical, and
Yeah.
I think it goes back to the fact that for as long as humans have been around, we've been telling stories. We've been sitting by campfires and sharing stories, and
Absolutely.
it's the thing that it literally is the thing that connects us to everything that matters in our lives, and that's why it's just so important that we don't allow that muscle to fade away.
Yeah.
We've and already we're seeing the impacts of that. Are you familiar with the that study that was done? It's the longest kind of human study. I forget how they frame it, but in essence, I think it's been running for about 70 years, and it was a study on happiness and health.
Mm-hmm.
The guy who ran it, I think his name's Robert Water. It's Robert W. anyway, but and the book is called The Good Life. He doesn't run the study the whole way through, like he's inherited it. He's the current guy running that study, but they essentially they checked all of these data points with what started out as being a bunch of guys, and they had a mix. They had a bunch of guys from, I think, a kind of rough part of Boston, and then they
Oh
had a
yeah.
bunch of
This is where
yeah,
JFK, right? John F. Kennedy was a part of the study.
yeah,
Yep.
exactly,
Okay.
exactly. That's right, that's
Yep.
right. And what they discovered though, when they crunched the data, was like the thing that actually had the biggest impact on your health and your longevity was the strength of your relationships. And so now there is this notion of you've got your mental health, you've obviously got your physical health, which I think everyone understands, but now there's this kind of third pillar which is emerging, which is called social health. And that, in essence, is the strength of your relationships. And if you're not investing in your relationships, which obviously you do, but it's something that will come back to bite you because the study shows it very clearly that those people who were lonely and no longer had strong relationships in their lives went on to die much quicker than the people who did.
Yeah. Yeah. Man, that's interesting. I've only just kind of heard of that story, but I've never read the book or anything. But
Yeah, I forgot that JFK was coincidentally part of that study.
yeah.
So, but yeah, it's again like just it's the easiest thing to do. Everybody wins. Like when you make a phone call, or even if you do just send a text message and say to someone, "Hey, man, I was just recalling this or thinking of you." And
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, I'm not a big user of Facebook these days. I loved the idea of it, and I was a big fan of the idea of connecting with friends. But things like on Facebook, where when it's someone's birthday or my birthday, and it gives you a canned a canned response.
Right. Yeah.
There's nothing in that, right? Like, there's just no like real emotion in that. Whereas, like for some of my close friends, where they've had big birthdays, I put videos together and got friends to record stories and then compile that into a video. And they wake up in the morning and they've got 15 people, including family members, recalling stories about how they met and what they love about them and things like that. And that is far more interesting than a canned happy birthday message in Facebook. And I just think
Yeah.
all of these things, it's just make that bit of extra effort and everybody wins from it.
Yep. Yeah. It's again, it's part of that. We're so connected that we're disconnected. They make it too easy. So
Yeah, exactly.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I've actually always said too. I think about things all the time. And I write them down, and I have a blog and everything. But when like I used to say, words count, words matter, etc. And I've kind of over the last couple months, I've kind of changed that to like words are magic, and I really do think that. The power of words, the power of story. You can change someone's life or you can destroy it. So I think what you're doing
So true. Yeah.
with Winnie, is really to, use the power of story, use the words, the magic of words to, keep people connected as time moves on.
Yeah.
Is it going
Yeah.
to be Apple and Android when it first comes out, or?
Yeah, it's going to be Apple initially. So sort of 5 years ago, I did an app with my brother-in-law, which was it's still out there actually. It's called 5 Habits, and it was kind of largely his baby, but because my career's been about bringing software to the market, I was helping him out, and it's. Yeah, basically we built this thing for both Android and for iOS. And the big learning that we had was that it's a huge burden of effort when you're essentially building two apps side by side. And when you are wanting to just test out what is essentially an MVP and you really want to find out what's working, what's not, you're better off just picking a platform. So we're going to launch on Apple, and then, again, depending on what works and what doesn't, we'll refine, and then hopefully we'll have enough users that it makes sense then to build out onto Android as well.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm gonna make sure that I put the links and everything to Winnie in there. But it's Winnie. How do you spell it?
Winny, WINNY.chat.
.chat. Okay. And one of the things, I wrote this down a while ago, but I wanted to see if you've seen this because I was fascinated by it. Have you ever seen the documentary that Val Kilmer, the actor, put together called Val?
I have. Yeah, I have.
I didn't know anything about it, but when I watched it and how he had a camcorder since he was like a teenager, or even younger than that, he basically documented his entire life, and I thought that was incredible. I thought, wow, what a great idea. This is, everybody can do that with this. It's fantastic.
Well, and that's the thing, and you can, but that's almost going to become one of the challenges, is that we're going to have so much content on our lives. It's like, well, like it's not like you suddenly get to 90 and then sit there and watch your life play back over the next 10 years with video footage. So it's like, how then do you kind of pick and choose the stuff that plays back? And and that's kind of a new problem that needs to be solved. But yeah, the Val Kilmer one, and again, did you end up watching the one with Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger? Did you see their documentaries?
I did actually, on Netflix. I think both of them.
Yeah,
I think,
exactly. That's right.
Yeah,
and look, I mean, biographies and autobiographies, I think, are incredible. What really struck me with both of those was, Arnold's sitting there, and both of those guys are in their 70s, pushing 80s now, and they've lived incredible lives, but both of them were there really just reflecting on family, and and in both cases they had regrets about how they hadn't spent as much time as they really wanted to with family. And yet many people would look at them and say they've got everything, they've done everything, but really what matters at the end of the day, and it tends to matter in most people's lives, is family. It's your family and your relationships. That's the thing that matters most.
I think pretty much everybody, including myself, once you get to a point where you have more past than future, I think things change a bit.
Sounds like you got a friendly dog in the background there who wants a bit of...
Yeah, apologize. Usually I'm the only one here, and I have my dogs in the pen because everybody's going to be coming in, and I didn't want them freaking out. But now this one, I think somebody must have come home. I'm not usually doing it this early because of the time change.
He's looking for some attention as well. He's hearing us talking about connection and relationships. He's like, what about me?
Yeah,
come on.
That's right. Man, well, it's been great chatting with you, Jeremy. I did and I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I did want to ask you one question before we go, and I was curious if you learned anything about Winnie when doing, kind of documentary story that you didn't know before, something that shocked you, or a really good story that she told you where you thought you learned something.
I learned so much, to be honest, through my nana. When I was living in England, I used to go, and she was in Manchester. I was living in London, and I was early 30s, and I would go and stay with her pretty much one weekend of each month. And it was like hanging out with a mate. And at this point, she was in her mid to late 80s, and but she was just such an interesting person to hang out with, and she kind of had that Northern English way of just being so relaxed about the way they tell stories and things like that. But so many things I learned. I mean, family stories. I'm trying to think if there was anything in particular. I think the main thing was, and it's kind of like everything we've spoken about, was just the importance of making an effort for relationships. Like my nana had when we were living in Australia, she would always send audio tapes of her and my granddad chatting, and then we would send audio tapes back. I mean, this is obviously all pre-internet, right? But we ended up super close, even though we were literally on the other side of the world. Me and my sister ended up super close with our grandparents. And I think that's probably the main thing I learned. Like, she would tell an incredible actual story. She just make stories up on the fly, as in sort of fiction stories. But yeah, I think one of the things I learned from my nana Winny was just how to connect, and the importance of making an effort to connect.
Yeah, fantastic, Jeremy. I never really knew my grandparents. I mean, I knew them when I was a kid, but really not much at all. And and
a lot of people don't.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't get to know that, and especially your great grandparents. I mean, most people can't even mention their names, right? And yet, that's your history. It's you're only a couple of generations removed. So again, that's my hope. I'm really hoping Winnie will kind of bridge that gap.
Yeah, I love it. I love the whole premise of it. I want to use it. I think it's
I can't wait to get you on it. Are you an Android or an Apple user?
Apple. So.
Oh, brilliant! Yeah. All right, cool. Well, let's connect over the course of the week, and I'll get you set up.
Yeah, awesome. Well, man, Jeremy, it sounds like you're doing some great work. I'm really excited for Winnie to come out. It's great to kind of learn a little bit about you and what you have going on, and I really appreciate it.
Okay, look, thanks so much, man. It's been awesome chatting with you, and I love what you're doing. I mean, you're essentially doing what Winnie's all about already. So kudos for you for doing what you're doing, and yeah, it's been a great chat. Thank you.
Absolutely, man. All right, well, you have a good night. I know it's really late where you're at. Again, I appreciate it, and we'll be in touch.
Likewise. All right, cheers, Jay. All the best.
All right, cheers.
Cheers, bye.
Bye. And there you have it, Jeremy Horne. I want to thank Jeremy for coming on the show and sharing a bit about his life. This was a fascinating conversation, and it's really got me thinking about what's possible and how to really step up my game when it comes to passing down my legacy to my family when I'm gone. It really does sound like Winny is the future of generational storytelling, and I'm really looking forward to jumping on board with the platform. I'm sure you got a lot out of today's episode, so do me a favor and leave a review so we can put the lives and lessons of those around us into the ears of even more listeners. Also, don't forget to like, follow, share, and subscribe to the show. If you're interested in being the next guest on the Stranger Conversations podcast, head over to strangerconversationspodcast.com, linked in the show notes, and sign up. It's as easy as that. If you aren't ready to join me but know someone who would be a great guest, share the show with them and encourage them to sign up. Be sure to follow me on social media at Real Tay Jones on most platforms. I'm Tay Jones. Thank you for listening, and we'll chat later.